We now want to move on to the next presentation, which is by Lauren Martin from Durham University on property, racial capitalism and migrant exclusion. Lauren, do you want to make a start in a minute?
Lauren, we cannot hear you. Maybe you are muted. Lauren, can you hear us?
Yes.
We hear you now.
We could just hear you.
I don't hear you, Lauren.
Okay. Is it
we
yes.
hear you now. Okay.
Teams.
Can you please share your PowerPoint screen so that I can put you online with it?
Perfect.
Fine.
Here we are.
You have the floor.
Okay. Fantastic. Sorry about that. I'd like to thank the organizers for making this happen. It's a genuinely Herculean effort to get all of the working pieces together, and especially across continents and time zones. So I thank them very much for allowing us to have these conversations. So what I want to talk about today is some research that I've been doing this year as part of a fellowship with the Independent Social Research Foundation, which is building on some previous work that I've been doing, thinking about the carceral economies of migration control. And so across these different pieces of work, I'm trying to draw together and extend the work of carceral, political, and critical migration scholars by drawing on other scholarship, interrogating modalities of racial capitalism, differentiation and multiplication of labor, and the commodification of life. And then in the paper today, I'm really trying to think through the role of financialization in all of this as well. In previous articles, I have argued for greater attention to the specific ways in which migrants become valuable, the legal procedures, socio-technical practices through which migrant life is made valuable to others, and the mechanisms of exchange that connect and compose these carceral economies. Together, this work seeks to fill a gap in critical geographic work on borders and migration control, which has been primarily focused on state practices and discursive practices, the juridical positioning of non-citizens as exceptional, excludable, and in varying states of rightfulness and rightlessness, the categorizations that make people detainable or deportable, and media representations that dehumanize and securitize migration, and of course, rich ethnographic work following migrant trajectories as subjects and as political actors. So my presentation today is an effort to further specify what is unique about carceral economies of migration control, and to work through what is similar and what is different, some of the shared practices and tactics, to other modalities of racial capitalism, surplus and fungible populations, and the devaluation of people and places. So more to the point, I want to ask how the financialization of detention real estate, or even the very idea of thinking of detention as real estate, produces migrants not as economic subjects, but as a quantifiable substance, as fluidity. So broadly, this set of research asks how financialization and other economic changes work in immigration and border patrol, and what carceral practices become when they're embedded in wider financial flows. Before continuing, there are a few things to understand about the US immigration enforcement system. Apologies for anyone for whom this is a repeat, but there's some sort of basic set of facts that are important to understand why we have so many detention beds in the first place. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the mechanisms and practices of policing and containment, but focus more on how detention infrastructure comes to be. but I'm happy to talk more about it in question answer or at the end. So a very, very, very quick tour of the U.S. immigration detention system. So the blue and red flags that you see on the map here indicate the roughly 250 detention facilities that detain non-citizens in immigration policing, immigration custody. This is a mixture of county jails and ICE-specific facilities. ICE contracts with county jails to hold non-citizens and with private sector operators who own and or operate facilities specifically for people in ICE custody. Detention is mandatory for certain categories of non-citizens who come in contact with Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Customs and Border Patrol. Detention has no time limit in the United States. Unlike other places in the world, there is no human rights jurisdiction governing this in the United States. And then even where asylum seekers and vulnerable groups get bail or parole, amounts are often prohibitively high, in the range of $5,000 to $12,000 and sometimes even higher US dollars. So you can imagine that's a difficult amount of money to come by if you're in detention. The result is that often people who might be eligible for release stay in detention throughout what can be a lengthy legal process. Capacity is really large. It's currently at 43,000 beds, and as I said before, 250 or so centers, including jails and prisons. How do people end up there? So there are a number of different ways that people can end up in detention. That could be through the kind of stereotypical encounter with Customs and Border Patrol or Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the borderlands, but also through raids on workplaces and in neighborhoods, collateral arrests of people who don't have sufficient documentation when they're actually looking for someone else. Local policing and partnerships between federal immigration enforcement and local policing, and the criminal prosecution of immigration-related violations in federal court, which sort of creates a deportable, detainable group of people by criminalizing the act of crossing the border. Okay, so apologies for having to move on from there fairly quickly, but that kind of sets the broader context. So I understand immigration detention to operate, therefore, through multiple mobilities. And here I'm drawing on the work of the previous presenters in particular, and also the co-authored Mounts et al. Article from 2013 that conceptualizes detention as a process, or more accurately, multiple processes of bordering, mobility, and exclusion, in addition to enclosure. Detention centers, or closed detention centers, are more severe spatializations, but should also be seen as one of many strategies of containment aimed at mobile people. Oops, sorry, there's the slide summarizing that, apologies. So there's been a volume of recent research investigating the expansion of detention through contracts with private sector actors in particular. As Flynn and Cannon point out in their 2009 article, private sector contracts include a wide array of activities, and so cannot be reduced to the ownership of prison-like institutions. So it can also include medical care, social services, things like this are also outsourced. Conlon and Heimstra have argued that the microeconomies of everyday life in detention merit closer inspection, as the strategic deprivation within detention pushes detainees into voluntary work programs and then to overpriced commissaries. And they call this an intimate form of accumulation by dispossession, wherein counties and local businesses, not private prison companies per se, cash in on migrant detention as well. With Deirdre Conlon and Kate Coddington, I've explored how encampment, detention, and discipline mobility, different but resonant carceral spaces, become valuable for others, and specifically how dependence and destitution open up opportunities for investment by others, investments that rely upon unsettled lives and suspended futures of people who are prohibited from settling or working or building a life. Detention centers and other containment strategies become embedded in various forms of circulation, or what Gill et al. Argue are meta-institutional circuits of value. So what a lot of this work has in common is a concern for the specific ways in which migrants in detention as a population are dispossessed of time, relationships, money, futures, while money and value, not to be confused with each other, accumulate for others elsewhere. An important, and one could say essential element of these arrangements, particularly in the United States, is the colonial and racist histories of both imprisonment as a solution to social problems and the economic arrangements that enable them. And so in my current project, I'm trying to think with recent literature on abolition ecologies and abolition geographies, especially to think about the role of land and land as property, as a particular kind of enclosure of land, and property as financial asset. So I'm very much inspired by Megan Ybarra's call to connect devalued people to devalued land in her recent article on the Seattle Tacoma Detention Center in Washington State. And also thinking with Ruth Gilmore's work on place-based racial formations, and in particular the ways in which very localized spatializations of racial inequalities map onto the valuation of people and land in particular ways. And these are not necessarily the same in every place, but in fact rely very much on local and regional histories in her account of the growth of of imprisonment, not just private imprisonment, in California. Bonds and Inwood have also wrote about, in their analysis of white supremacy in the United States and in settler colonial societies, of incarceration as a property regime. So trying to connect patterns of mass incarceration to patterns of property ownership, devaluation, and dispossession. And this also resonates with the work of Kevin Grove and his co-authors, thinking about the place-specific racial topologies that allow us to think about what changes in order that certain inequalities are maintained. So you can look at how this maps out in urban landscapes in different ways, especially in US cities, to maintain what is a very regular and rather predictable pattern of socioeconomic inequality that maps onto racial difference in a pretty regular way. And then I'm also thinking with and struggling with King and Hartman and Lowe at the moment to think about Black fungibility as a specific racial economic form and the ways in which this may or may not map onto migrant fungibility. So this is what I'm experimenting with today. So I'm going to walk through the stories of two family detention centers owned by CoreCivic, which used to be known as CCA, or the Corrections Corporation of America. I do this to show, to be able to tell a few different stories of the ways in which various histories overlap. So it's in part rhetorical and strategic, and in part because these are places that have become important to the geography of immigration detention. And then I stay with CoreCivic for a bit longer, describing how it has organized its activities and seeks investment and understands its own value. And I close by arguing that migrant fungibility, or the abstraction, agglomeration, and circulation of migrant life, holds carceral economies together. Okay. So the Don Hutto family, it is now just a detention center for adult women. So you can see it in the map on the right. The red arrow is pointing to it, and it's identifiable by the white ring road that goes around it, and that's the road that is patrolled 24 hours a day by surveillance vehicles. The picture on the left is the view of the center as you drive into town on West 2nd Street or State Highway 79. And the center is usually blocked by these freight trains, which some are usually parked there. So it's very much invisible to most of the residents on a daily basis, and anybody driving by would not necessarily see it. And I sort of stayed with Hutto for a moment because the story of its namesake, T. Don Hutto, is an interesting one. T. Don Hutto was one of the founding CEOs of CEA in the early 1980s. But before he founded CCA, he worked for the Arkansas prison system and was instrumental in reforming the system so that the prison system produced more money than it spent, turning a profit. And I point to this to show that the state has been very much invested in the economies of imprisonment for a long time as well, before the private sector became involved. And the land on which the Hutto facility was built in 1995 was sold to CCA by the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Diocese of Texas. The Catholic Church came into the property as a donation from a community group who managed the land as a recreation space for Mexican Americans. And they came into that land during the Jim Crow era, when seasonal agricultural Mexican and Mexican American workers needed somewhere to sleep besides Taylor proper. They were allowed to park and sleep in Hidalgo Park, which was, unsurprisingly, on the industrial side of the railroad tracks. And the street names in this area of town, which you can see sort of to the right of the red arrow, if you were to zoom in, you would see Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, MLK Jr. Boulevard, and so on. The street names, continue to this day to reveal something of the story. And so the color line organized who could be where, who could own what, and also over time, what it became worth. And temporary labor migration has been particularly important to agricultural production in this area of Texas for a really long time, especially cotton. And so the profitability of the Hutto medium security prison built in '95 was predicated on the racialized devaluation of this land. That it later became a detention center for asylum-seeking families and then later women shows a kind of counterintuitive relation of dependence that these economies have on mobile people and mobile labor. But it got me thinking about how infrastructure like empty land and places like this become available for prison building, and the role that racialization plays in making particular places and properties available for enclosure in this way, and especially the role of temporary and mobile labor in this. So now I'm going to turn to a second facility that was built in 2014. Thank you. That was built in 2014 and opened in 2015. This is a few hundred miles away from the Hutto facility, which is northeast of Austin. So the Dilley facility was built by changing the wording on an agreement with CCA in Eloy, Arizona, which is a sort of strange geography to all of this, and then repurposing and expanding short-term rental housing that was built and developed for fracking industry workers in Texas. So this is the part of the highly productive Eagle Ford Shale region, for those of you who are interested in the resource geographies of all of this. Much was made of this man camp when the facility was built, playing off the contradictions between masculine labor and feminized vulnerability. And here again, we have partially developed residential real estate, again housing temporary mobile labor as the precursor to a family detention center. And real estate has become more important to the ways in which private corrections organize their work and pursue profit. So the histories of these two facilities pose questions for geographers about the legacies of racialized segregation and how that interlaces with labor migration, how racialization imbues landscape as property value, and how the devaluation of people and land make certain places available for things like detention center development. So again, following Megan Ybarra's call to connect devalued people to devalued land, this has meant for me in this project attending to the overlapping valuation of occupants as fungible migrants and carceral space as real estate. So in the last few minutes, I'd like to think more about detention as real estate. So what does it mean to think of detention in this way? And so I think there's more even to the story than what these places were before. So on this slide on the left, this is Sendero Ranch in Pearsall. This is not the facility that was turned into the Dilley facility, but the buildings are exactly the same, and it's the same property development company that built both of them. They shared a name and so on. On the right are the plans from the environmental impact assessment showing how the new facility was going to build on the short-term rental housing that was already there. So in 2012 and 2013, the US's largest private prison corporations, CCA and Geo Group, moved from or transformed from C Corp corporate structures to real estate investment trusts, or REITs. And this was a very popular thing to do at the time. It was part of trying to access capital and liquidity following the financial crisis. And in doing so, they reorganized their operations around property and services, and segmented carceral spaces from security services, allowing government agencies to contract with either or both. And they also moved aggressively into things like alternatives to detention, which we'll hear more about from Carolina Sanchez tomorrow. And so this shift accompanied a renaming and rebranding for CCA and Geo Group. And they have since invested quite a lot of money in their corporate social responsibility reports in an effort to kind of rebrand themselves as public service providers. And in calls, they in shareholder conference calls and investor webinars, they compare themselves very often with other unique asset classes, in quotes. So hospitals, care homes, and so on and so forth. And bought mostly by investment funds who also invest in other unique asset classes. Prisons as real estate become fungible, abstracted real estate investments, valued more for the certainty and risk of future revenue than the services or quality of services they provide. And so they reflect what Paul Langley has called assetization, property as generative of investments and rents as collateral and as capable of bearing debt. Carceral REITs are therefore following trends and broader trends in commercial real estate, but what is perhaps novel here is thinking of prisons as commercial real estate. Contracts between ICE and Core Civic or Geo Group organize things in a different way, however, pricing property and services in terms of bed days. So they sort of bring those two segments back together in the way that they actually contract with government buyers. So they think in terms of occupancy and time. So people must occupy beds, be confined, and the more and longer they do so, the more secure payment levels and dividends for investors will be. So my question in this project has become, what do migrants, what does migration become when we dwell here in these economic rationalities? What kind of economic subject or object are the occupants in this case? The occupant is necessary, but is not the consumer, as in a hotel or hospital. The occupant must be living, but need not thrive. Occupants are only profitable in the plural, in mass. They are not persons, but populations. Formally and institutionally, they are made fungible and exchangeable and transformed from people with lives and stories and relationships to chargeable bed days. Occupancy operates here as a collective noun, a divisible quantity, but in this form, it doesn't matter who occupies a bed, really. Occupancy is valued and priced and commodified, but only in a sense. And it is the occupancy of living migrants in the process of living and staying alive, usually living for another time, going back home, getting a job, meeting family, moving on, moving back, and so on. And so for Tadier, this liquid lifetime is surplus, excess, and convertible into any number of things and actions for the value-producing movements of others. For Tadier, surplus lives become like cash, reserves of potential energies to be held and released for various projects. For detention occupants, thanks, I'm almost finished. Migrants' cash value for others is more than metaphorical. So I want to argue that migrants in detention dwell in a specific form of migrant fungibility, a fluid fungibility. So from the government's perspective, quantity and movement are key, and I'll just conclude here. ICE's aim is to increase deportations and minimize the amount of money it spends to do so. So it's really more concerned with high throughput and high flow through, and preferably not much pooling or staying or getting stuck. And so this operates, I think, as a reversal of the aquatic metaphors of migrant floods and waves and surges and invasions that are present in media representations. It's not enough that migrants become fungible and exchangeable and interchangeable as detention occupants. ICE also demands that they be fluid. So with the deportation, at least from ICE's perspective, as the presumed trajectory, financialized detention space relies on both exchangeability and volume, occupancy and mobility. Asylum seekers as subjects of human rights, migrants as laborers are abstracted into migrant flows, de-individualized processes of nature to be captured, channeled, and redirected, always flowing, but never stopped. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. just before we start the questions, I just thought it would be worth highlighting the real connections that have already appeared in the session between the two papers. And I think in particular, there's a connection between how staff and detainees hold carceral economies together on the one hand, and how landscapes work and how very much they're invisible to maybe local communities, to just the general public and so on, and how we could see in the maps how those landscapes develop and so on. Mm-hmm. So I just I would be quite interested to know, I guess that I'll just read it out. I guess, do you think for-profit prisons can be stopped by letting, for example, the government-owned prisons instead of being privately owned, or would this issue persist? I guess this is about the kind of public-private dichotomy. Can you say a little bit more about that, Lauren?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So, so when it comes to private prisons in the criminal justice system, in the US context, there have been moves to deprivatize. So under the Obama administration, they decided to deprivatize the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So these are people who are tried and sentenced in federal court. California recently passed a resolution to deprivatize its prison system, but that does not necessarily mean it will get smaller. So the debate there has been very much between California prison guard unions and the private sector, which of course pays less and isn't unionized. So I think that there are pathways to republicizing, I guess, prisons. I think in the US context, when it comes to immigration detention, that's more difficult because ICE has relied almost entirely on infrastructure provided by others. ICE does not own detention centers. So it's either the private sector or other governmental bodies that are providing it with detention space. So county facilities, Bureau of Prisons facilities, federal marshals facilities, and so on. So what I'm interested in fact, is the kind of transferability. This is what I found so interesting about the previous presentation as well, is how infrastructure can so easily be repurposed. So one of the family detention centers that opened and closed really quickly in 2014 was the Artesia facility, which was in a former Border Patrol training facility, which was a former military training complex. And the crossover in the borderlands between military infrastructure, and detention infrastructure and immigration policing and border enforcement it's rife. I mean, it's formal. There's cooperation between the National Guard at times, and I mean, and so on and so forth. They also share facilities and trainings. So there's all kinds of cross-pollination between them. So I think that the question of private versus public really depends on which agency you're looking at, and then how those become embedded in the broader carceral landscapes. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I think we're almost running out of time for another question just now, but maybe we could just load up, Maya could already load up her presentation, then we can continue the conversation for another minute or so. What I thought was really, really interesting, and maybe what we could discuss in the chat rooms later, is the kind of connection between, on the one hand, the kind of really in-depth theoretical work and the connection to abolition, and I guess financialization and abolition have kind of a long history, but I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit more later, Lauren. I thought it was really, really interesting.